I can still see that night in my mind like it's frozen there. The glow of the chandelier so bright it made the polished table shine like water, the smell of champagne hanging thick in the air. I was standing by the door with a tray in my hands, just like I had 1,000 times before. Coffee pot and cream steady, my apron pressed, my face calm. That's who I was to them. Helen, the housekeeper. Always composed, always invisible. But then, Richard Harrington slapped his palm down on a thick stack of papers, smirked, and said loud enough for the whole room to laugh, "Translate this and I'll give you my monthly salary. 300 grand, Helen. Think you can handle it?" My heart clenched hard in my chest. The men around him burst out laughing. One of them choked on his champagne, spraying it across the crisp white cloth, and the others howled like boys at a frat party. I stood there, not moving, not blinking, just holding the tray, pretending I was part of the wallpaper. But inside me, something sharp twisted, because I had heard words like that before, years ago in another city, when I was still Dr. Helen Davis teaching Chinese law and language. Back then, I was dismissed with the same kind of smirk, the same careless arrogance that reduced years of my life to a joke. That memory hit me fast, and for a second it felt like the ground tilted under my feet. Diane Carter, his financial director, finally sighed, brushing back her sleek hair, her watch sparkling like a car payment on her wrist. "Richard, do you always have to do this?" she said. Not angry exactly, more tired, the way someone sounds when they've given up trying to fix someone's manners. He just waved her off with that careless laugh. "We're just having fun. Helen gets it." Fun. That's all I was to him, a punchline in a night full of booze and backslapping deals. I set the coffee pot down on the table, carefully wiped the edge of the tray with a folded napkin. Details, always the details, because order was the only thing I could claim as mine. And then, only then, I lifted my head and met his eyes. His were glassy with drink and full of himself. Part of me wanted to shrink away like I always did, smile politely, walk back into the kitchen and let it slide. But another part, the one that remembered late nights with dictionaries and lecture halls filled with students, straightened my back, and instead of showing even a flicker of the sting I felt, I asked, calm as ever, "Would you like me to bring you anything else?" They laughed again, like even my composure was part of their show, but I carried the sound with me, heavy and loud, because something had shifted. In that moment, standing there with their laughter bouncing off the walls, I realized I wasn't holding just coffee and cream. I was holding the proof that I was more than the role they had written for me. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for them to see it. I remember how the laughter followed me out of that room, echoing down the hallway like it was chasing me. Richard waved his hand and said, No, we've got everything. Just don't forget by morning." And the men roared again, their glasses clinking, their arrogance filling every inch of that mansion. I gathered the papers off the table, dense pages covered in charts, tiny print, and rows of Chinese characters stamped with red seals. The moment my eyes touched those marks, I felt a jolt run through me. It wasn't just random text. It was business Chinese, precise, legal, and sharp, the kind I hadn't seen since my teaching days in Boston. I pressed the folder tight against me, whispered "good evening" the way I always did, and slipped out, closing the heavy oak door behind me. As I walked down the long carpeted hallway, the sound of their laughter stayed behind, but it clung to me like the smell of cigar smoke. I had carried trays down that hall for 20 years, meals, laundry, birthday cakes for their kids, stacks of books for their college essays, and each time I passed, I was nobody, just Aunt Helen, the quiet housekeeper. And yet that night, with those papers tucked under my arm, I felt something waking up inside me. In the kitchen, the air was cooler, the buzz of the refrigerator the only sound. I laid the folder on the counter and took a long breath, one of those breaths where your chest tightens before it releases. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone, scrolling through numbers I rarely dared to touch. There it was, Paul Edwards, my old colleague, my one remaining link to the life I had buried. I hadn't called him in months, maybe longer, because every time I saw his name, I was reminded of who I used to be and how far I had fallen. Still, I pressed the button. My voice was low, almost apologetic, as if I had to explain myself. "Good evening, Paul. I'm sorry it's late. This is Helen Davis. I need your help. I have a technical document here. Chinese, high level, the kind used for energy infrastructure or government audits. They want it translated by morning. Could you at least confirm the terminology? I'll send you photos." I snapped a few shots, the light from the kitchen lamp reflecting off the glossy paper, and sent them off. The screen glowed with "delivered," and I stared at it like it was a lifeline. I didn't expect him to answer right away. It was already close to 1 in the morning, and I still had to finish my shift before I could head home. But just seeing his name lit up again, just remembering there was one person in this world who knew the truth about me, steadied me enough to keep moving. By the time I finally slipped my phone back into my pocket, it was almost 1 in the morning. I didn't expect Paul to answer right away, not at that hour. I finished my shift the way I always did, quietly, carefully, checking the bar to make sure it was fully stocked, shutting off every burner in the kitchen, turning each lock on the heavy glass doors. Those small rituals always made me feel like I was sealing up not just the house, but all the noise and arrogance inside it. Then I pulled on my old coat, the lining worn thin at the cuffs, and stepped out into the cold night air. My car waited under the trees, a faded sedan that rattled when I turned the key, but it carried me faithfully through the quiet streets. I drove back toward my neighborhood, a tired row of apartments in Queens, where the lights in the hallways flickered and the intercom never worked. The tile by the stairwell had been cracked for years, and no one ever fixed it. But I didn't mind anymore, because inside my little ground floor place, everything was different. My space was spotless, ordered, mine. I slipped into soft lounge clothes, brewed a pot of green tea, and sat at my kitchen table. On the shelf in the corner was my old laptop, and beside it, a leather-bound notebook I hadn't opened in years. My diary from my university days when I taught classes, guided graduate students, and filled page after page with notes in Chinese, Korean, English. I opened it and ran my fingers over the neat handwriting, the glossaries of terms, the diagrams of contracts I once explained to students who looked at me with respect. I had almost forgotten what that felt like. And then the memories hit. The day they told me I was no longer welcome at the department, the search through my office, the way I had to pack in a rush and leave Boston behind. No diplomas, no titles, not even my real name. Just a trail of silence and a job that made me invisible. I had buried it all so deeply that sometimes I wondered if it had even happened, but those notebooks proved it did. I powered up the old laptop, switched the keyboard to Chinese input, and pulled my tea closer. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but my hands moved almost instinctively. Half an hour later, my phone buzzed on the table. Paul's message lit up the screen. "Helen, good to hear from you. This is serious. Looks like a transfer of patent rights and server access, disguised under technical language. If you need help with terminology, I'm here." I stared at the words for a long moment, my throat tightening. Someone still believed me capable. Someone still saw me. Paul's message glowed on my screen, calm and steady, just like the man himself. "This looks like a protocol for transferring patent rights and server access. A lot of hidden clauses. I can help with terminology if you need. The rest, you'll handle better than any lawyer." My throat tightened as I read it. He knew. He was the only one left who knew who I really was, and he had never betrayed me. Not once. That knowledge steadied me more than the tea ever could. I pulled the desk lamp closer, its yellow light cutting a small circle against the dark. The rest of the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I spread out the pages, opened my laptop, adjusted the input to Chinese, and pressed my fingers against the keys. It had been years, but the rhythm came back like muscle memory. The characters flowed, my mind juggling meanings, structures, legal terms, technical jargon. With every line I typed, I felt myself slipping back into the woman I used to be, the one they had stripped of her title but not her knowledge. By 4 a.m, my eyes burned so badly I had to rub them every few minutes, but I couldn't stop. I checked every sentence twice, sometimes 3 times. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't even notice until I knocked the cup over and had to push the damp notebook aside. Some terms were so specialized, they sent me digging through my old leather-bound glossary, tracing the margins where I had scribbled tiny explanations for students who'd asked me the same questions years ago. I could almost hear their voices again, bright, curious, full of faith in me. It felt like another lifetime, yet here those voices were, keeping me awake and focused. The deeper I went into the document, the more sinister it became. Words that looked harmless to an untrained eye. Phrases like asymmetric quantum encryption, cross-protocol connectivity, secondary security key were really weapons dressed up as technical filler. To a casual reader, it was boring nonsense, but to me it screamed danger. It was a trap, a carefully written backdoor into everything this company owned. I picked up a pen and started scribbling notes in the margins. Clause 6.2, the line that claimed to provide bilateral access for security monitoring, really meant something far more chilling: remote administration of the company's servers by the Chinese side. No limits, no time frame, no oversight. It was like signing away the keys to the kingdom while pretending it was just housekeeping. As I wrote the words down, my hand trembled. The men in that mansion had laughed at me, but what I held in my hands was no joke. It was the difference between keeping their empire and losing everything, and they had tossed it into my lap like a party trick. By the time I circled that line, no approval required, no time limit, I leaned back in my chair and felt the blood pounding in my temples. That was it. A hidden back door, plain as day if you knew what you were looking at. They had dressed it up in polished language, but what it meant was surrender, complete and irreversible. And it made me sick to think that in the very house where I'd washed their laundry, cooked their meals, raised their children, even sat at the bedside of Richard's dying wife, not a single person had ever asked who I really was. For 20 years I had been convenient, invisible. Richard always called me my Helen, the way you'd refer to an old armchair. Familiar, useful, but without thought. Even the children I'd held and rocked through the night called me Aunt Helen, as if that title explained away everything I had once been. They never asked about my past, never wondered about the books I read in the kitchen after they went to bed. Once in a while, on Christmas or Thanksgiving, they'd hand me a shiny box of chocolates with a polite smile, and that was supposed to pass for gratitude. I glanced at the clock. 5:30 in the morning. My translation was finished. 4 tight pages in clear business English, plus one more sheet filled with notes, blunt and undeniable, spelling out every trap buried under those harmless-looking clauses. I emailed copies to myself, printed everything twice, slipped the set into a folder, and smoothed it flat with both hands. It was the most important work I had done in years, maybe in my entire life, and nobody in that mansion had the faintest idea it was even possible. I shut off the lamp, pushed back from the desk, and allowed myself exactly 2 hours of sleep. No more. At 7 sharp, I needed to be back on duty like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just spent the night saving the empire of a man who thought of me as little more than background noise. When I walked into the Harrington estate that morning, the silence was uncanny. The house hummed with the low grind of the coffee machine, and I could hear the faint swish of a mop somewhere down the hall. Everything looked ordinary, polished, scheduled, like the storm I'd lived through in the night had never touched this place. But I knew. The storm was in my folder, in my hands, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't just the woman in the apron moving silently through their halls. I was the one carrying the truth. That morning, I went about my chores the way I always did, wearing the same white housecoat, moving through those quiet halls like a shadow. I set the breakfast plates on the table, dusted the bookshelves no one ever read, folded fresh sheets in the guest rooms that almost never saw guests. And just like every other morning for the past 20 years, no one looked at me. That was the role I had learned to play, present but unseen. At exactly 11:12, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Richard Harrington appeared, hair tousled, his t-shirt wrinkled, coffee steaming in his hand. He grinned like he had the upper hand in some private joke. "Good morning, Helen," he said brightly. "So, how'd you enjoy our little Chinese bedtime story? Hope you didn't stay up too late trying to make sense of it." His laugh was ready, perched on his lips. Behind him trailed Diane Carter, sharp as ever even in the morning light, and young Anthony Miller, rubbing his eyes and stifling a yawn. I didn't answer his joke. Instead, I reached into my bag, pulled out the neat folder I had prepared, and placed it carefully on the table. "The translation is ready," I said, my voice quiet but steady, "and so is the list of corrections." My hand lingered on the folder for a second, as if I were setting down something heavier than paper. "With your permission, I highlighted the most critical points." He chuckled, ready to dismiss me like always. "Wait, what? You?" He flipped open the first page with a smirk, eyes skimming lazily across the lines. But the smirk began to fade. A crease formed between his brows, and he leaned in closer. By the third page, his fingers gripped the paper so tight the edges crumpled white. "Hold on," he muttered, the color draining from his face. Diane was already moving to his side, heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. She snatched a page from his hand, scanning the lines. Her lips moved soundlessly as she read, and then she stopped, frozen. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. She looked at Richard, then back at me, and in that instant the balance in the room shifted. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. I was the one holding the truth, and they knew it. Diane snatched the folder from Richard's hand so fast it made the papers snap. She flipped through the pages, her face tightening as her eyes raced line after line. "This can't be real," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. God, did no one review this before it was signed? Who the hell missed this backdoor clause? Her voice was sharp now, cutting the silence like glass. She turned to Anthony, who was still half asleep, clutching his phone like it could shield him. "It's real," Diane said flatly, shaking her head. "We're basically handing over remote control of our servers and the patents, everything tied to future development. It's all in here." I looked at Richard then. The man who had laughed at me hours earlier, who had tossed this job at me like a joke, now sat pale, his knuckles pressed white against the edge of the table. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Finally, he managed one strangled question, his voice low, almost childlike. "Who even are you? How do you know these things?" I met his eyes, steady, unblinking. "I've worked in this house for 20 years, I said. But before that, I spent 10 years teaching Chinese language and Eastern law at Boston University. Before I had to leave it all behind, I was an associate professor, a PhD. The words hung there like smoke that wouldn't clear. No one moved. Diane stopped breathing. Anthony froze mid-scroll on his phone. The only sound was the steady drip of the coffee machine, each drop hitting the tray like a metronome, marking the silence. Richard dragged a hand down his face, as if he could rub the confusion and disbelief away. The man who thought he had seen everything, who thought I was just part of the furniture, suddenly looked at me like I was a stranger who had walked into his home uninvited, and for the first time in decades, I let him. Richard's voice cracked as he stared at me, disbelief written all over his face. "You're telling me you did all of this yourself?" I held his gaze, calm but tired from the long night. "Not entirely," I admitted. "There were a few terms I double-checked with a colleague, a professor I used to work with, but the translation, the analysis, the notes, that's mine." My voice didn't waver. For once, I wanted them to hear me clearly. Diane was still clutching the folder, her expression shifting from shock to something sharper, almost wary. "So, you're a professional translator, with this level of expertise?" Her words trailed off, and I saw the question she didn't dare finish. "Why on earth are you here, in this house, in that apron?" I let out a soft breath. Sometimes it's easier to be nobody than to risk your life being somebody, I said quietly. When the government wants you as a specialist but sees you as a problem as a person, you only have two choices: disappear or break. I chose to disappear. Anthony finally found his voice, blurting out the first thought in his head. But you could have worked at any embassy. With your skills... He stopped when he saw the look on my face. Not with the documents I had left, I said, shaking my head. Not with the risks I carried. That door was closed the moment I walked away. And besides, not everything in life comes down to a career. Sometimes it's just about surviving, about being there for the few people who matter. Richard pushed his chair back suddenly and stood unsteady, as if the floor had shifted under him. His face was drained, his hand gripping the edge of the table like he needed it to stay upright. God, he whispered, his voice raw. These clauses. If we had signed this blindly, we'd be finished in 6 months. They'd have everything. Our servers, our patents. It was a trap. The weight of his words filled the room, pressing down on all of us. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't the invisible woman cleaning around the edges of their lives. I was the one who had seen what none of them could, and they knew it. Diane's voice cut through the tension, steady but tight. It was brilliantly disguised. None of our lawyers caught it, not one. They don't know the language, Richard. They just run documents through their templates. She turned then, and for the first time since I had known her, her eyes on me weren't dismissive. She wasn't looking at a housekeeper anymore. She was looking at a professional, an equal. Richard sat back hard in his chair, as if all the air had been sucked out of him. His hand trembled against the armrest, his coffee cooling beside him. "You saved us," he said finally, his voice low and unsteady. "You saved the company. You saved me. You saved my children." The words hung in the air like something too heavy to hold. His chest rose and fell, but nothing else came out. The silence that followed was so thick it pressed against my skin. Then he looked up at me, his face pale with shame. "Why did you even help me?" he asked, the words breaking apart. "After everything. After the way I treated you. Like furniture. God, I even joked about it." His voice cracked, the last words strangled, and he looked away. I shrugged, the smallest gesture, but my voice was steady. "Because this is still my job. Because whether you realize it or not, the health of this company doesn't just fund your yacht. It pays my wages. It keeps a roof over my head. It gives me a chance to help my sister with medical bills and send my nephew to college. This isn't just your empire, Richard. It's my livelihood too, and I care about that. Do you?" He sank back into the chair, eyes hollow, staring into nothing. His hands gripped the armrests like anchors. "This is the most humiliating day of my life," he whispered, broken. "And you're the most valuable person I've ignored for 20 years. He turned almost blindly toward Diane. His voice was hoarse. "Alert legal. Everything from China needs to be rechecked. Every word. And..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "Put her in charge of it." Richard's voice was still shaky when he finally turned to Diane. "Every Chinese contract, go back, recheck it all, and set up a new review group. Helen will lead it." I raised my hand before Diane could answer. "No," I said, steady but firm. "I can't work on staff. My name can't appear on any public record. My family still faces threats, and I won't put them at risk." Richard blinked, his mouth half open, then nodded quickly, desperate. "Then as a private consultant, remote work, closed protocols. Whatever you want. Set the terms, I'll sign them." I studied him for a long moment, not with anger, not even with triumph, but with the calm weight of someone who had waited years for this kind of respect. "I need 3 conditions," I said finally. "First, confidentiality. Second, a flexible schedule. Third, no more humiliating the staff. Not me, not anyone else. Not as a joke, not as a throwaway comment. Never again." The room went still. Even Diane looked at him, waiting. Richard's jaw worked, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. Then, slowly, he stood, came around the table, and did something I never expected. He held out his hand. "I promise," he said softly, "and I'm sorry for all of it." I clasped his hand, short and firm, nothing sentimental, nothing theatrical, just one human being acknowledging another. For the first time in 20 years, the handshake felt equal. "Then I'll accept your offer," I said. My voice didn't rise or waver. It simply was. And I made it clear from the start that I wasn't doing this for him. Not for Richard, not for his empire or his ego, but for myself and the few people in my life who still mattered. When I said those words out loud, he nodded, and the sound he made as he exhaled was like someone finally setting down a weight they didn't even know they were carrying. That was the moment we both understood. This wasn't about loyalty, it was about boundaries, and for the first time, mine were being respected. The changes didn't come with grand announcements or sweeping declarations. They crept in quietly over the next 2 weeks, subtle but undeniable. In the bathrooms, towels no longer littered the floors like offerings to invisible servants. In the kitchen, the sharp snap of fingers aimed at the staff disappeared, replaced by simple human words like "please" and "thank you." The endless parade of loud parties slowed down, and the few dinners they did host looked less like banquets and more like meals meant to be eaten, not flaunted. It was as if the house itself exhaled, tired of being a stage for arrogance. Richard began to change too, though in ways that would have been unthinkable before. Once I caught him carrying his empty coffee cup into the kitchen and setting it in the sink, quietly like a man trying to make up for decades of careless entitlement. He didn't announce it, didn't make a show, but I noticed. And maybe more importantly, so did the staff, who stood a little taller, walked a little slower, as if they no longer needed to shrink to survive in that house. I wasn't there every day anymore. By design, my work had shifted into something far freer. I logged into secure servers from my little apartment in Queens, combing through documents, flagging dangerous clauses, sending notes straight to the company's legal team. My inbox filled with questions from attorneys who once would have brushed me off, now asking for clarification, leaning on my judgment. And in every meeting, every contract, the rule I'd laid down, no more jokes at the expense of staff, was followed without question. That condition mattered most, and Richard honored it. One morning, he walked into his office alone, sunlight spilling over the garden outside, and I was told he stood at the window, whispering to himself, "How many years did I spend building this empire? And I nearly gave it away for a bit of pride." On his desk, he found a plain envelope. Inside was a document stamped with the seal of his legal department, an official appointment naming me as an independent linguistic consultant. No flashy title, no press release, just recognition that my work was indispensable. And though my name didn't need to appear anywhere public, the truth was out. I was no longer invisible. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like myself again. I made it clear from the start that I wasn't doing this for him. Not for Richard, not for his empire or his ego, but for myself and the few people in my life who still mattered. When I said those words out loud, he nodded, and the sound he made as he exhaled was like someone finally setting down a weight they didn't even know they were carrying. That was the moment we both understood. This wasn't about loyalty, it was about boundaries, and for the first time, mine were being respected. The changes didn't come with grand announcements or sweeping declarations. They crept in quietly over the next 2 weeks, subtle but undeniable. In the bathrooms, towels no longer littered the floors like offerings to invisible servants. In the kitchen, the sharp snap of fingers aimed at the staff disappeared, replaced by simple human words like "please" and "thank you." The endless parade of loud parties slowed down, and the few dinners they did host looked less like banquets and more like meals meant to be eaten, not flaunted. It was as if the house itself exhaled, tired of being a stage for arrogance. Richard began to change too, though in ways that would have been unthinkable before. Once I caught him carrying his empty coffee cup into the kitchen and setting it in the sink, quietly, like a man trying to make up for decades of careless entitlement. He didn't announce it, didn't make a show, But I noticed, and maybe more importantly, so did the staff, who stood a little taller, walked a little slower, as if they no longer needed to shrink to survive in that house. I wasn't there every day anymore. By design, my work had shifted into something far freer. I logged into secure servers from my little apartment in Queens, combing through documents, flagging dangerous clauses, sending notes straight to the company's legal team. My inbox filled with questions from attorneys who once would have brushed me off, now asking for clarification, leaning on my judgment. And in every meeting, every contract, the rule I'd laid down, no more jokes at the expense of staff, was followed without question. That condition mattered most, and Richard honored it. One morning, he walked into his office alone, sunlight spilling over the garden outside, and I was told he stood at the window whispering to himself, "How many years did I spend building this empire? And I nearly gave it away for a bit of pride." On his desk, he found a plain envelope. Inside was a document stamped with the seal of his legal department, an official appointment naming me as an independent linguistic consultant. No flashy title, no press release, just recognition that my work was indispensable. And though my name didn't need to appear anywhere public, the truth was out. I was no longer invisible. The paper that landed on my desk that morning was plain, almost blunt in its simplicity. No name, no title, no fanfare, just a signature from the director of the legal department. That was the agreement. I would stay in the shadows, unseen. But the shadow now had weight, influence, a voice that mattered in rooms I'd never been invited into before. It was enough. Weeks later, at a corporate dinner celebrating a new partnership with Japanese investors, Richard stood with a glass raised high. His words weren't the kind that usually came from him. "We survive," he said slowly. "Not because we are the smartest people in the room, but because sometimes fate gives us a chance to finally notice someone we've overlooked. And that alone is worth drinking to." The room buzzed with polite confusion. No one knew what he meant. No one but Diane. She caught my eye from across the table, gave the faintest nod, and that was enough to let me know she understood. A month later, my inbox chimed with another request, this time from the legal department, a financial report tied to a joint software development agreement with an Arab partner. On the surface, it looked routine, nothing more than the usual strings of figures and clauses, but I had learned not to trust routine. I dug into every paragraph, pulled at every thread, let no line escape me, and there it was again, buried in polite legal phrasing, a tiny loophole that gave the partner the right to hand over development to third parties without consent. One line that could have bled the company dry if left unchecked. I flagged it, rewrote the clause, and sent it back, my notes clear and sharp. Hours later, a short email came. No flourishes, no public praise, just 2 words. "Thank you." Along with it, a payment. This time $300,000. No smirk, no offhand joke about my place in the household, just a wire transfer with signatures and seals. The kind of acknowledgement that had been denied me for so many years. That night, sitting at my kitchen table, I opened my banking app and moved the money out as quickly as it had come in. A portion went to my nephew in Canada to cover his college tuition. Another to my sister, drowning in medical bills. The rest I tucked away in savings, a quiet fortress for the future. For the first time in years, I didn't just feel like I was surviving. I felt like I had control. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't dared to hope for. Control. Real control. Not the kind you pretend to have when you keep your kitchen spotless or line your shoes neatly by the door, but the kind that comes from knowing you can help your family, that you can decide where your money goes, that you are steering your own life again. I paid my nephew's tuition in Warsaw, covered part of my sister's medical bills, and tucked the rest into savings. And for a moment, sitting at my little table, I felt taller than I had in decades. It was mid-spring when Richard surprised me. He showed up on my block in front of my worn-down apartment building where the intercom hadn't worked in years. His black car sat against the cracked curb, so out of place among the beat-up sedans and faded minivans. He didn't ring, didn't knock, didn't even wait. He simply left a box at my door and drove away. Inside the box was a brand new laptop, far better than the relic I'd been struggling with for years. Next to it, a Parker pen in a leather case, its weight heavy in my palm, like something meant to last. And then, wrapped in brown paper, the piece that made my breath catch, a bronze nameplate engraved Dr. Helen Davis, linguistic analyst, expert in international agreements. Tucked beneath it, a note written in Richard's hurried scrawl, "It's your choice whether to hang it or not, but know this, you're the expert now. Thank you." I stared at that plate for a long time, my fingers tracing the letters of a name I hadn't dared to show the world in years, my real name, my real life. And though I couldn't bring myself to hang it on my door just yet, I slipped it into my drawer like a promise waiting for the right moment. Having the choice meant more than the title ever could. Freedom, I realized, was better than recognition. Weeks later, I found myself across from him at a cafe table. Not in his mansion, not in my apartment, but on neutral ground. 2 cups sat between us. 1 black coffee, no sugar, 1 cappuccino with cinnamon dusted on top. He smiled faintly, almost shy, and said, "Did I guess right?" as he slid the cappuccino toward me and settled into the chair opposite mine. "Almost," I said softly as I lifted the cup, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. The cappuccino smelled faintly of cinnamon, just the way I liked it. This wasn't his grand office with its leather chairs and ego carved into the furniture, and it wasn't my cramped apartment where shadows had always been safer. We were in a glass-walled conference room on the 18th floor, neutral ground. Half a year had passed since the night I uncovered the trap in that Chinese contract. Half a year since everything shifted. Richard leaned back in his chair, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of that smug edge I used to hear. "The Singapore deal closed," he told me. "Clean, airtight, not a single legal gap. The whole team quotes you now, even the lawyers. They're learning from you." His words hung in the air, but I didn't flinch, didn't shrink from them. I just nodded steady, the way someone does when they finally know their own worth. He tapped the folder on the table, pushing it toward me. Inside was a contract, different from the ones I usually tore apart. This one was for me. Permanent position, office, salary, security guarantees, power I hadn't had in decades. The kind of offer that could have pulled me back into the official world, with a title, with recognition. I could sign it and be visible again. I could step out of the shadows once and for all. He looked at me carefully, as if testing the ground. "You once told me you weren't ready to hang that nameplate. Are you ready now?" His voice carried both hope and hesitation. I rested my hand on the folder, felt the weight of what it meant. To sign was to reclaim the past, to return to who I had been. But it also meant surrendering the freedom I had fought for in silence. I lifted my eyes and met his. "And you, are you ready?" I asked quietly. His brow furrowed. "Ready for what?" I didn't look away. To see, to actually see. For real this time. He drew in a long breath, the kind that feels like it drags years out of your chest. It was heavy, almost painful, and when he finally let it go, I knew this wasn't just about contracts anymore. It was about whether he could truly change, whether he could recognize me not as part of the background, but as someone who had always been here, unseen but vital. He nodded finally, his voice rough but honest. "I'm learning," he said, and for the first time I almost believed him. I picked up the pen that lay between us, opened the folder, and instead of signing where they expected me to, I neatly struck through the line about a fixed position. My hand was steady as I wrote in the margin. Independent consultant, full access, right to refuse public acknowledgement. Then I signed my name, the name I had hidden for so long, and pushed the folder back across the table. "I choose to stay free," I told him, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet conviction of someone who had earned the right to say it. To be useful without titles. I am not an object. I am a person. And my choice is to see, to hear, to help, but always on my own terms. Richard's eyes softened, and I saw a crack in the armor he'd worn for decades. He swallowed hard and whispered, "You didn't just save the business. You pulled me out of my own arrogance, out of the blindness I didn't know I lived in. Thank you." I turned my gaze toward the window. Far below, people hurried across crosswalks, cars pushed through the traffic lights, the pulse of the city beating steady and indifferent. Everyday life, ordinary and unremarkable. And yet, for me, it had shifted. I wasn't invisible anymore, not because anyone had granted me recognition, but because I had finally claimed the right to decide who I was. I stood, gathering my things, and said lightly, "Tell Diane that clause 8.4 in the Brazilian agreement needs another look. And next time you feel like joking about $3 million, do us all a favor. Just order a good cup of coffee instead." My smile was calm, steady, and this time, fully my own. I walked out with my head high and back at home, the bronze nameplate still rested in the drawer. Sometimes I would take it out, trace the letters with my fingertips, Dr. Helen Davis, expert, and slip it back again. Because I no longer needed to hang it on a door to prove who I was. They knew, and more importantly, so did I. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt invisible? Like people only saw the role you played and not the person you really were? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them, and your stories mean more than you know. Don't forget to hit that like button if this touched something in you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. We're building a space here for women who've lived, endured, and found their strength again, and I'd love for you to be part of it.